point that the mandates in the budgets at all levels of government really preclude any meaningful change. And yet, during the past midterm election, there was a lot of talk about we have to reduce government, and David and others made the point that there's a big difference between cutting out a few dollars of administrative waste and reducing mandates. Dick Ravitch made the point that the press isn't covering government. It seems to me that if the public isn't educated about this distinction between the kind of canard of let's reduce government and that'll cure all ills, as opposed to let's fix the legislative morass in which we live, we will never get change. And so the question I've got is, how do we get to the press? We're in the New York Times building. How many people from the New York Times are here today to cover this discussion? And how do you start educating the public?
I have to say, Bob, I don't think that's a fair question. I mean, we're all putting out a newspaper for tomorrow morning. But the truth of the matter is that publishing newspapers is no longer a profitable business. And more newspapers are dependent upon other sources of income, despite the fact that the ownership is committed. Certainly the Times ownership and the Washington Post ownership are committed passionately to inform the public. But they're dependent on other sources of income other than the advertising in their newspapers, because advertisers are moving their money away from the print media to the internet.
And I'm sorry, I wasn't being critical of print media. My point was to use that as a metaphor for how do we get whenever public media is effective to start drawing the distinction for the public between the phony issue of let's reduce big government and let's focus on the stifling mandates that are making it impossible to reduce budget deficits.
Well, I appreciate that, but again, there are mandates that have cost impacts. I acknowledge that. There are a lot of things. But something which Philip has written about eloquently, like malpractice tort reform, which had they put into New York State, which I passionately advocated a year ago when the budget was being prepared, a system of tort reform similar to what somehow the politicians in California were willing to accept, it would have saved $400 million. But nobody was interested. Why? Because trial lawyers had given too much money to the people in politics. That's why I believe that you have to go to public campaign financing to get those kinds of things changed.
There are more specific reasons than that. How can New York State has always been the last in tort reform? Because the Speaker of the Assembly is openly and notoriously is on the payroll of a leading negligence law firm and receives at least hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from them. And the amount that he receives is not required to be reported, but everyone knows that he does this, and it is at this point technically legal. There's a rule called vicarious liability. That means that if you rent a car and if you have an accident, not only are you liable, but the company that rents the car to you is liable, even if they had no knowledge that you would have an accident or you weren't drunk or you had a clean record or whatever. 49 states of the Union abolished vicarious liability because it added enormously to the cost of rental cars. The New York State Senate abolished it, which was Republican at the time. It came up in the Assembly, and the majority of the members of the Rules Committee supported it. Speaker Silver, the morning of the meeting, appointed 3 new members to the Rules Committee, and the proposed to eliminate vicarious liability never made it to the floor. Now, the only way, this is all true and specific and literal, this happened. The only way it was abolished, and it was abolished, is that 3 Republican legislators went down to Washington and got the House to write into the transportation funding bill a requirement that no state could have vicarious liability, and the practice was ended. But the power of the Speaker is enormous, and the power to put matters on the floor, keep them off the floor, or to move anyone's matters. Anyway, and the Speaker was just reelected in the primary with 69% of the vote.
And every newspaper against it, and the mayor against it, the mayor actively helping his opponent. And I have to say, there are many things I can fault Shelly for, but I do not think that his decisions as leader of the legislative body are determined by how much money his law firm pays him. And I really do that. And number 2, I point out that is McCarthy-like innuendo. The New York Times, 5 years ago or so, put one of the classiest investigative reports the New York Times had for 6 months looking into Shelly Silver's, and they could not end up concluding that he had done anything that was ethically wrong. Now, you may not like the choices he makes, and I disagree with him about a lot of things, but I don't think it's fair to refer that he is preventing tort reform solely because of his compensation. But you raise a question that nobody in this room, quite surprisingly, has asked. Should members of the legislature be able to have other employment? Doesn't that per se create a lot of potential conflicts? And the answer is yes, but it is also true, in my judgment, the term limits, by definition, create conflicts, because if somebody can't run for a 3rd term, they spend most of the 2nd term trying to figure out how to get a job to support their families thereafter. Second of all, we have a constitutional principle in the United States. Our forefathers, again, said we wanted our legislative bodies to be composed of doctors and lawyers and farmers, etc. It has never been ruled out legally that legislators shouldn't have other employment. It's a perfectly permissible change to make, as far as I'm concerned. Have a full-time legislature and bar other full-time employment, but you're not going to get that unless you're willing to pay a lot more, and you better think very carefully about what the difference in the quality of people you're going to get if you do that.